The objective for this lecture is to construct a phylogenetic tree for chordates. First, let's define the features that chordates, or the traits that chordates share. The reason that they're called chordates is because of two features that involve a chord. The first of these is the dorsal nerve cord. Dorsal is a word that means back, so this would be a nerve cord that runs along the back of the animal. In humans and other vertebrates, the dorsal nerve cord is called the spinal cord, which is of course an important component of the central nervous system, along with the brain. Another trait that chordates shared is called a notochord. The notochord is a flexible, supportive structure. So it provides support to the organism itself and also to the nerve cord. You may not be familiar with the notochord because in mammals the notochord disappears during embryo development. So this appears only in the embryo in some groups. The next trait are pharyngeal slits. Pharyngeal is referring to the location. So these would be found just behind the mouth. And the easiest way to think about these is to think of a fish and to think of its gills. So they may become gills, which allow for gas exchange and allow water to pass out of the mouth. Or in land animals, these pharyngeal slits become parts of the ear. The final trait that all chordates share is a post-anal tail. So this just means that the nerve cord, muscles, and any skeleton extend beyond the anus. Obviously, we don't have a post-anal tail, so for animals which do not have a tail, this tail may exist only in the embryo, just like the nose. Okay, so most chordates belong to a group called the vertebrates, and vertebrate is referring to a backbone. But there are a couple of groups that of invertebrate chordates. So let's look at those really quick. The first of these groups is called the tunicate, and the tunicate looks nothing like what you would think of as a chordate. They are sessile, which means they are attached to a surface, and they're filter feeders, so they take in water and filter out nutrients and then release the wastewater. So they are very different from most other chordates. However, their embryo is free swimming, so it would have many of those features of the chordates that we just discussed. The next group looks more like a chordate, and these are called the lancelets. In the lancelets, you can see that we would have the anus would be here, so everything that's behind the anus would be the post-anal tail. It's difficult to differentiate between the nerve cord and the notochord here, but the lancelets have a notochord that runs all the way along their back. The notochord would be just below the nerve cord, although that's difficult to see in this particular example. The lancelet has a mouth, and just behind the mouth, again a little bit difficult to see here, you would have those pharyngeal slits. We'll get to see some lancelets in lab next week, so you can observe these features with the microscope. So those are the invertebrate chordates. No backbone, no skeleton that's supporting that nerve cord. So let's move on and talk about some of the vertebrate chordates. So vertebrates do have a backbone. The first couple of these groups are groups that you're probably not very familiar with. The first group of these has a mouth that's like a sucker. So we'll call it a sucker mouth. And notice that it looks very different from our mouth, and that's because it has no hinged jaw. It has an opening that's a mouth, but it doesn't really have a jaw. The next group, the hagfish, are very similar. The hagfish look kind of like an eel. They're very slimy, so they do have a backbone, but they also have, if you look at their mouth here, they also have no jaws. So these two groups of vertebrates have a backbone, but they have no jaws. So let's go through the features of the vertebrates. And vertebrates made a similar transition onto land as the plants did. And we can review challenges to life on land as we did for the plant. So if you want to, you can go back and review those from plants, or you can think of those on your own, remembering what we learned about plants. So recall that getting water can be an issue if you're on land. Keeping the water or not losing it can also be an issue or a challenge. Exposure to radiation was more of an issue in life on land. Support in the air. Getting around, this is something that wasn't such an issue for plants since they don't move around, but if you're an animal, you need to move around to get food and to get what you need. So locomotion would be an issue if you are an animal living on land. And then the same issues that plants had in terms of reproduction and dispersal. So if you aren't quite sure what those two things mean, you can go back and review what we talked about with plants. And you'll see that animals have some of the same adaptations, or not exactly the same, but very similar adaptations to life on land that the plants did. Okay, so we're going to go over vertebrate trends or traits. So these would be traits that some vertebrates have and some vertebrates may not have. So let's start with the backbone. The backbone's main job is to protect the nerve cord. So with bones, we call these bones our vertebrae, and they're part of our skeleton. So we already discussed briefly hinged jaws. So this means that the mouth can open and close or open and shut very efficiently. You can have biting and chewing with these hinged jaws that you weren't able to do with an unhinged or just an open mouth. Bone, although backbone implies that all of these animals have bones, they do have bones, but some bones are made of cartilage, while other bones are made of a harder substance called bone. So tetrapods are the groups of vertebrates that live on land. Tetrapods, of course, have 4 limbs, and we looked at Tiktaalik, who may have been an ancestral form of these 4-limbed animals that first were able to walk on land. All vertebrates that live on land belong to this group, the tetrapods. Okay, the next one has to do with reproduction. So once you're an animal that lives on land, you need a way to get your sperm to your eggs, just as in plants, and you can't just release your sperm and eggs into the water as most marine animals do. So instead you need to have internal fertilization, where the male delivers the sperm directly to the female, or to the egg, inside the female. This is something that is a new adaptation for life on land. Another reproductive adaptation has to do with what happens once that sperm fertilizes the egg and you have a zygote. That zygote, if you're on land, needs to be protected in an aquatic environment. So this is what's called an amniotic egg. An amniotic egg provides a protected and nourished aquatic environment to the growing embryo. So this allows the parent to provide resources for that embryo to grow early in its development, similar to how a parent plant can provide resources to its embryo in a seed. Okay, the other thing that should happen internally on land is gas exchange. The structures that are involved in gas exchange on land are the lungs, and so the lungs just allow for gas exchange to happen internally, so that a lot of water is not lost when that gas exchange is occurring through the skin, as happens for marine and aquatic organisms. Okay, the last 2 features belong to our own group, so you should be fairly familiar with them. The first one of these is hair. So hair provides protection and insulation. Hair is also known as fur. And the last one is milk. And milk also provides nutrition to the developing animal. As we did for plants, let's fill out a chart that includes these traits and see which groups of animals have which traits. So some of you should be familiar with all of these groups. We talked about the invertebrate chordates already here. Remember, those were the lancelets and the tunicates. We looked at the lampreys and the hagfish. Sharks and rays are another group. Bony fish are another group. Amphibians, reptiles, and mammals are the three groups that live on land. So these are all chordates, so we could say that they're all going to have the feature of a nerve cord. And you may want to pause and see if you can fill this chart out on your own, because you probably already have some information. So you could pause, fill out the chart, and then come back and see what you missed. So remember, backbone belongs to all the vertebrates, and every group except for the invertebrate chordates would have this backbone, or the vertebrae. And all the groups except for the invertebrate chordates and the lampreys and hagfish have jaws. The first group that has jaws is the sharks, so that makes it really easy to remember that sharks have jaws. However, sharks do not have bony bones. They do not have bones that are made out of bone. They have bones that are made out of cartilage, so they would be excluded from this feature. Tetrapods include those groups that live on land, so that would just be the amphibians, the reptiles, and the mammals. The amniotic egg goes along with internal fertilization, and amphibians do not have internal fertilization. They do not have a protected aquatic environment inside their egg, like inside an egg shell, but reptiles and mammals do have a protected aquatic environment. Similarly, amphibians do gas exchange through their skin, so reptiles and mammals are the ones that really do that internal gas exchange that requires the lungs. And hair and milk are two features that are only found in mammals. So remember that how we construct phylogenetic trees, we pick out the two groups that have the most traits in common, and then we put those two branches next to each other, and we kind of work our way backwards through the tree.